Have you ever sat before a decision where just one more step would change the course of your life completely, and you were so scared you couldn't move? That autumn at the small train station of Red Willow Creek, a train came to a halt amidst the dusty winds of the Wild West. Passengers disembarked one by one. The sound of shoes echoed on the platform and then faded into silence. But in the last carriage a woman remained motionless. Her name was Eliza Monroe. She clutched the old bag tightly in her hand. No tears, no calls, just sat there as if stepping off this platform meant there would be no turning back. At an age when people often say it's too late to start over, Eliza was facing a choice that froze her heart. Down on the platform, Thomas Caldwell, the man who had been waiting for this train, sensed something was amiss. He didn't shout. He didn't urge. He didn't order. He simply climbed onto the train and held out his hand. It's not about pulling her down. It's about giving her the right to choose. If it were you, what would you do? Step down to face a completely new life, or stay in the familiar but empty place? Would you trust a stranger, or trust the fear that has followed you your whole life? This isn't just the story of a mail-order bride. It's a story of quiet courage, of choice, and of a love that didn't begin with passion but with respect. If you're ready to walk down the platform with Eliza that year, stay with me for this story. And before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to listen with me to stories that soothe the heart in a very real, very down-to-earth way. Autumn arrived early in the Kansas frontier that year. Not vibrant, not boisterous. Just a pale, yellow blanket of grass, as if the earth and sky were slowing their breath after a harsh summer. The wind carried dry dust sweeping across the small train station at Cottonwood Falls, where the tracks were just wide enough for one train a day. The sound of the iron wheels grinding against the tracks echoed long, deep, and hoarse, a sound one only truly appreciates after having traveled too much and no longer expecting anything new. The train from Omaha came to a slight halt. The doors of the carriages opened. People disembarked one by one, carrying suitcases, wooden crates, and unspoken dreams. A few scattered laughs, a brief greeting, a hurried wave. Then the platform gradually emptied. The last carriage remains. Margaret Hale remained seated. She didn't look out the window. Nor did she watch the people who had just left. Her hands rested on her lap, clutching a worn leather bag, the kind people only keep when they don't have much money inside, but which held too much to throw away. The strap pressed against her thin, trembling fingers, as if letting go would cause her whole being to slip from the hard wooden chair. Margaret was over 40. In the East, that age was considered late. In the West, age was rarely mentioned, but the look said it all. She knew it. She knew it before boarding this train. She knew it from the moment she read the letter, written in neat, unadorned handwriting, promising a marriage decent enough to start over. Outside, the ticket inspector walked along the carriage, glancing inside, then stopped. "Ma'am," he said softly. Margaret looked up, nodded slightly, but did not rise. He understood. He said nothing more. In this land, people had learned not to force decisions that were already too difficult. When the train whistle blew again, signaling it was about to leave the station, Margaret gently closed her eyes. "If I step down, there will be no turning back." The thought wasn't noisy. It didn't scream. It came slowly, like winter creeping across the steppe day by day, until one realized they were standing in the cold without even noticing. She wasn't afraid of the man she'd never met, not afraid of the farm, nor afraid of labor. What paralyzed Margaret was the realization that this might be the last time in her life she would allow herself to believe in something new. At this age, people no longer fear failure in the way they did in their youth. They fear hoping again, only to have to learn to live in silence afterward. Margaret had once hoped. She had been the youngest daughter in a large Pennsylvania family. She had cared for her ailing mother for years. She had heard unfulfilled promises, and she had been left alone in an empty house as everyone else went their separate ways. No one had done anything wrong, but no one stayed. For others, this train journey might just be a trip. For Margaret, it was the thin line between simply existing and daring to live again. Outside the carriage door, the wind blew harder. Dry leaves swirled in small circles on the wooden platform. No one noticed them. Just as no one noticed the woman still sitting in the last carriage, where the autumn light had only just touched the threshold. Time seemed to slow down so much that one could clearly hear the sound of metal cooling under the train wheels. Margaret opened her eyes. She looked down at the bag in her hand. Inside were an old Bible, several letters folded many times, and a silver spoon, her mother's only memento. Nothing in it guaranteed her a future, but it all reminded her that she had come a long way to be here. The train whistle blew one last time. The ticket inspector approached slowly. "We're about to leave the station, ma'am." Margaret nodded. She still hadn't stood up. There are decisions in life that don't require flamboyant courage. They only require a moment of absolute honesty with oneself, and the price of that honesty is often irreversible. She took a deep breath. Not to step down, just to allow herself to sit still for one more moment, long enough to understand that this fear was real. And because it was real, it deserved to be confronted, not denied. At Cottonwood Falls, the autumn sun was higher in the sky. Light streamed through the carriage window, falling on Margaret's worn shoes. She gazed down at the light for a long time. And somewhere out on the platform, though she was unaware, there was a man who hadn't left yet because he believed that every good beginning needed to be waited for. And it was in that very moment, as Margaret hesitated between the light and the doorstep, that a quiet presence changed the rhythm of the platform, not with a call, but with the rare patience of a man from the frontier. As the train nearly disembarked its passengers at Red Willow Station, the western afternoon became strangely quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the kind of stillness that only appears when a place is more accustomed to saying goodbye than welcoming. The wind blew along the tracks, carrying the scent of dry grass and cold iron. The old wooden planks beneath the feet of the waiting people creaked softly, as if reminding them that time was still passing, whether people were ready to or not. Thomas Caldwell had been standing at the end of the platform for some time, his wide-brimmed hat held in his hand instead of on his head. He wasn't in a hurry. Never had been. That's what people said about Thomas, that he did everything with a deliberate slowness, as if going too fast would cause him to miss something more important than the outcome. The station master went back inside. A young couple left hand in hand. The sound of their footsteps faded, then disappeared. Thomas instinctively glanced around, checking the carriages one last time. And it was then that he realized no one had disembarked from the last carriage. Not out of curiosity, not out of a sense of responsibility, but because of a familiar feeling, the feeling of someone who has stood at crossroads with whom no one else would stand. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't ask questions from a distance. Thomas stood still, gazing at the open train door, the afternoon light slanting across the metal steps. In that moment he understood perfectly. If anyone remained inside, they needed no further reason to panic. What they needed, perhaps, was simply someone who wouldn't make their fear worse. He boarded the train. The Simsurm 2000. Thomas's footsteps hit the iron steps with a dry, soft sound, just enough to signal his presence without intruding. Inside the carriage, Eliza Monroe sat motionless on the wooden seat by the window. She had her back to him, but Thomas saw it clearly. Her shoulders stiffened for a brief moment, a reflex of someone accustomed to self-preservation. He paused, maintaining just the right distance, not too far to appear indifferent, nor too close to become intimidating. Thomas took off his hat. He held it to his chest. He stood still. For several seconds no one spoke. Only the sound of the wind coming through the carriage doors and the metallic creaking of the train cooling down after the long journey could be heard. Then Thomas spoke, his voice low and deep with the accent of the meadows where people learn to speak less and think less. "Ma'am, you don't owe me anything." Eliza didn't turn around immediately, but the hand, resting on her old cloth bag, loosened slightly. Thomas continued, still in the same rhythm, without rushing, without expecting anything in return. "You can take your time. No promises. No conditions. Just a statement that allows others to slow down in a world that constantly forces people to make decisions too quickly." Eliza slowly turned her head. Her eyes weren't as panicked as Thomas had seen in other women who had traveled to the West on mail-order trains. They were more weary, deeper, as if she had carried too many years she hadn't yet put down. Thomas didn't ask for names. He didn't explain who he was. He understood that at this moment, any title was a luxury. He just stood there, a man from the frontier with dusty boots, a jacket worn at the cuffs, and a direct gaze that neither avoided eye contact nor scrutinized. Eliza observed him for a long time. She realized one thing: this man wasn't standing there to greet her, but to wait for her to come out on her own if she wanted to. At Eliza's age, one is accustomed to being pressured to accept, pressured to be grateful, pressured to treat rare opportunities as a debt. But Thomas Caldwell was different. He stood on that ship as if accustomed to letting others dictate their own pace. Perhaps it was because he understood very well that any relationship that begins with coercion will end in silence. Eliza took a deep breath, not because he said anything special, but because for the first time in years no one had told her what to do next. Thomas took half a step back, very slightly. A small gesture, but Eliza saw it. And she understood. That space wasn't a retreat. It was a silent invitation. Outside the setting, sun streamed into the train carriage, touching the weathered wooden floor. Time seemed to slow down long enough for a woman who had been tossed about by life so many times to ask herself, if I step off this time, will it be because I choose to and not because I'm being forced? Thomas didn't wait for an answer. He just waited with the patience of someone who had lost enough to understand that every good beginning needs time to be trusted. And it was in that unconditional waiting that something very fragile yet very real began to blossom between two strangers. And when Eliza finally placed her hand in the space before her, she wasn't just stepping onto an unfamiliar platform, she was stepping into a place for the first time in years where she felt she could stay even if only for one more night. Eliza Monroe's hand placed in Thomas Caldwell's was not a spontaneous gesture. It happened so slowly that Eliza herself was surprised by her own composure. No trembling, no haste. Just a quiet decision made after so many years of being accustomed to not having the power to decide. Thomas's hand was warm, dry, and smelled of sun and leather. He didn't squeeze. He didn't pull. He held just enough for Eliza to know that if she stepped down, there would be someone standing there not to possess her but to walk beside her. Eliza stepped down the steps of the train. The wooden platform of Red Willow Creek Station creaked softly beneath her worn shoes. It was a very faint sound, but to Eliza it resonated like the end of a life spent in places where she didn't belong. She stood up straight. For the first time in years, the small town of Red Willow Creek wasn't crowded, but it was enough for people's eyes to meet. An elderly woman simply dressed, following a man everyone recognized that couldn't go unnoticed. There were a few curious glances, a couple of polite nods, no malice. But there was no welcoming either. Eliza sensed it all. She had lived long enough to understand that people's gazes weren't always judgmental but always questioning. Thomas didn't lead her quickly. He walked slower than usual, as if adjusting his pace to match the person walking beside him. He didn't link arms with Eliza. He didn't put his hand behind her back. The distance between them was still enough so that neither felt invaded, but also close enough so that neither felt left out. Red Willow Creek in the late afternoon possesses a quintessential borderland beauty. Low wooden houses with faded paint. The blacksmith shop on the corner still smells of hot iron. Further away, a small church with a simple bell tower stands silently, like an old man who has witnessed too many departures. Eliza sees everything with the eyes of someone who doesn't rush to ask, "Do I belong here?" but simply quietly acknowledges this place exists. Thomas led Eliza to a stop in front of a two-story boarding house, its wooden sign on the porch swaying in the breeze. Mrs. Hawthorne's boarding house. Eliza paused for a moment. She didn't ask a question, but her eyes spoke volumes. Thomas understood. "She'll stay here first," he said, his voice even needing no lengthy explanation. Then he spoke clearly, word by word, as if to make sure Eliza heard and believed him. "You'll have your own room. Your own pace. Not us. Not the farm. Not the future. It was just a room, and a rhythm of life determined by Eliza herself." Eliza nodded. She didn't know why her throat tightened, but she didn't cry. People don't cry when they're finally treated with dignity. They just fall silent. Mrs. Hawthorne opened the door. An older woman, slightly older than Eliza, with neatly tied-up gray hair and a straightforward, uninquisitive gaze, looked at Eliza for a moment, then said simply, "The room upstairs. It has a window overlooking the valley. No further questions, no probing, no demands for explanations." Eliza entered the inn carrying her old bag, but this time she didn't feel like she was asking for a ride. She felt like she was simply stopping by. Thomas remained on the porch. He didn't follow Eliza upstairs. He didn't wait. He didn't try to prolong his presence. Before leaving, he only said, "I'll be back tomorrow morning. If you'd like. No conditions. No pressure." Eliza stood on the wooden staircase, her hand resting on the railing. She watched Thomas's back as he left the inn, walking slowly toward the dirt road leading out of town. A man doesn't turn around to check if he's being watched because he doesn't need that confirmation. Eliza's room was small but clean. A wooden bed, a small table, a basin of water. The window opened onto the Red Willow Creek Valley, where the afternoon breeze rustled through the tall grass, creating gentle waves like the breath of the earth. Eliza placed the bag on the bed. She sat down. And for the first time in years, there was no need to think about what the next step would be. That evening, Eliza ate a simple meal in the communal kitchen. No one asked her where she was from. No one asked how long she planned to stay. The conversations revolved around the harvest, the weather, and the fact that the stream to the north was drier than usual this year. She listened, and in that listening, Eliza realized something very small but very important. No one considered her a burden. Night fell. Eliza lay in bed listening to the wind rattling against the window frame. Not the sound of a train, not the sound of iron wheels, just the wind, steady, patient. She thought of Thomas Caldwell, not as a future husband, just as a man who had given her something she thought she had lost the right to be safe without feeling indebted. Eliza closed her eyes. She didn't know how long she would be at Red Willow Creek. She didn't know where this story would lead. But for the first time in many years, she didn't feel like she was running away. Instead, she was allowing herself to stay. And from that very morning, as Eliza stepped out of the inn into the gentle sunlight of Red Willow Creek, days without promises, but filled with quiet presence, began step by step, slowly, like the rhythm of life on the frontier. The morning in Red Willow Creek arrived gently, as if unwilling to disturb those accustomed to waking with worry. Sunlight filtered through the valley, touching the wooden roofs and low fences, leaving thin streaks of light on the still damp dirt road. Eliza Monroe stepped out of the inn with a light coat draped loosely over her shoulders. She stood still for a moment, taking a deep breath, letting the scent of dry grass and pine fill her lungs. No train noise, no metallic sounds, just an ordinary morning, and that's what calmed her heart. Thomas Caldwell waited at the end of the porch, leaning lightly against a wooden post. He hadn't arrived earlier than necessary, nor later. When Eliza saw him, Thomas merely nodded slightly, a thin, subtle smile, as if they had both implicitly agreed that today didn't need to begin with anything grand. "Let's go for a walk," Thomas said. Not an invitation, not a plan. Just an open suggestion. They walked slowly, side by side, along the town's main street. Thomas didn't talk about himself. Not about the farm, the past, or what he had lost. He only introduced the people Eliza was about to meet, as if the town were made up of individual faces, not buildings. They stopped in front of the Miller family's bakery. The smell of freshly baked bread wafted out, warm and familiar. Mrs. Miller stood behind the counter, her hands stained with flour, her hair neatly tied back. Thomas simply said, "Mrs. Miller is up at 4 in the morning every day." No further praise. No explanation of why it was so valuable. Eliza looked at the woman's hands, recognizing the resilience etched on each finger. She nodded slightly as a silent greeting. A few more steps, they passed the small wooden church. The bells hadn't rung yet. The doors remained closed. Thomas said succinctly, "Here people come when they need silence more than when they need answers." Eliza paused for a moment. She didn't go in. She simply placed her hand on the door, feeling the cool grain of the wood. There are places where you don't need to open the door to find peace of mind. The path led them to their old school, a one-room house, low windows, an open courtyard. Thomas recounted that last winter, when the snow covered the path, the teacher still came, lit a fire, and waited. Not every day there were students, he said, but he came enough times so the children would know someone believed they would return. Eliza looked at the window, imagined the sound of chalk hitting the blackboard, and felt a warm shiver run down her spine. Throughout the morning, Thomas introduced the people, not himself. He recounted things in short snippets: who tended the spring, who held the key to the granary, who cooked soup on snowy days. Eliza listened, not needing to memorize all the names. What she remembered was how people lived for each other in this place, quietly, without fanfare, but persistently. Eliza noticed her breathing had become lighter. Not because the town was perfect, it wasn't. Everything was simple, even somewhat rough. But here no one was in a hurry to define her. No asker, no fiancé, no burden. Just Eliza, a woman walking in the bright sunshine with a man who kept his distance. They stopped at a small grocery store. The shopkeeper placed 2 apples on the counter and pushed them towards Eliza. "Eat these to ease your fatigue," he said. Thomas didn't object. Eliza hesitated for a moment, then took them. The gesture was so small that one might overlook it if not paying attention. But for Eliza, it was a greeting that needed no explanation. At lunchtime, they sat on the wooden steps in front of the bakery. Eliza ate half an apple, savoring the sweet and sour taste. Thomas didn't ask her what she was thinking. He looked out at the valley where the wind played in the tall grass. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was like an empty chair that had been set aside. Whoever needed it could sit in it. As evening fell, they returned to the inn. Thomas stopped at the gate but didn't go in. "Tomorrow, if you wish, we can continue," he said. It was the same phrase, "if she wished." Eliza nodded. This time not out of politeness. She wanted to. The following days passed like that. No promises. No long-term plans. Thomas took Eliza around town at different times: early morning when the blacksmiths lit their furnaces, midday when the church opened, afternoon when the children ran and played in front of their old school. Each place was a small slice of life. Each slice helped Eliza understand that staying didn't mean being held back. Eliza observed. She learned to recognize the rhythm of Red Willow Creek, a rhythm that neither forced anyone to hurry nor allowed anyone to be lazy with their duties. She realized Thomas lived by that rhythm. He arrived on time. He left on time. Unpretentious. Unreserved. It was a drizzly afternoon. They took shelter under the church eaves. Thomas told a story about a man who had come to town and then left, leaving behind his violin. No one kept it, but every evening someone would dust it off. Eliza listened and smiled. These stories weren't meant to impress. They simply laid the groundwork for trust to sprout. Gradually, Eliza began to participate in very small tasks, helping Mrs. Hawthorne fold towels, carrying soup to a family with a sick member, watching the blacksmith work long enough to understand why fire needed patient care. Thomas didn't stand by her side. He let Eliza find her own place, however temporary. One evening, Eliza realized she was no longer counting the days. She slept more soundly. She woke up with a strange feeling, no need to prove anything. She didn't know where that would lead. But she knew she was walking without having to defend herself. And it was during those days without promises that Eliza began to understand that love, if it exists, doesn't come with a sudden spark. It comes with a consistent presence, with aimless walks, with a man choosing to introduce himself to the world before introducing himself. And when Red Willow Creek had become so familiar that Eliza no longer needed Thomas's guidance, it was on a quiet evening that old memories long held back found their moment to speak, unlocking the deepest part of her healing journey. Evenings in Red Willow Creek tend to descend slowly. Not because the sun lingers, but because the people here are accustomed to letting the day end at its own pace. The sunset gradually fades from the valley, leaving a warm gray hue on the wooden roofs. The wind is gentler than during the day, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dry grass. In Mrs. Hawthorne's inn, the oil lamp is lit, its yellow light gently swaying, with each step a reminder that night is a time to slow down. Eliza Monroe sat at a small wooden table by the window. She had just finished folding napkins for Mrs. Hawthorne, a task she had undertaken a few days earlier, unassigned and unpaid. Thomas Caldwell sat opposite her, a distance sufficient to avoid making the space feel cramped. 2 cups of tea sat on the table, now slightly cool. Neither was in a hurry to drink. The silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers. It took on a different hue, the hue of patient waiting, as if both understood that there are stories that can only be told when the listener is not in a hurry. Eliza gazed at the oil lamp for a long time. Then she spoke without looking at Thomas, without any preparation. "I haven't told this story to anyone for years." Her voice was even not trembling, but Thomas noticed Eliza's hand lightly touching the edge of the table as if searching for a tiny point of support. "My mother passed away before I even understood what it meant to be with her," Eliza continued. "She was ill for a long time. I was the one left behind. The others, they had their own lives." She paused, not because she was choking, but because her memories needed time to sort themselves out. Thomas didn't ask. He didn't lean forward. He simply remained still, like an open door, but not pulling anyone through. Eliza recounted the years that followed when she lived with relatives. No one was cruel, but no one truly considered her part of the family either. She worked. She was silent. She learned not to bother because somewhere along the line she had come to believe that her existence needed to be justified by obedience. People don't say it out loud, Eliza said, her gaze still fixed on the lights. But I've always known. I don't belong anywhere. The words fell very softly. So softly that if one didn't listen, they would miss them. But Thomas heard them. Eliza recounts whispers, judgmental glances, instances of being considered too much or not enough. No major event. No overt tragedy. Just a long series of days of being looked down upon enough to teach one to withdraw into oneself. She didn't tell the story to complain. She told it as if she were flipping through an old notebook, reading aloud the faded words, not to correct them but simply to acknowledge that they once existed. Thomas sat still. He had heard many stories in his life, bigger stories, more heartbreaking stories, but he understood that lifelong losses were often quiet. They wore him down slowly, leaving a person who knew how to stand but no longer knew how to rely on anyone. When Eliza stopped, the room fell silent. The oil lamp flickered softly. Thomas didn't ask any further questions. He didn't look for details. He didn't try to understand everything. He spoke only in a low, slow voice, as if he had carefully considered each word. That sounds like a heavy road to walk alone. No advice, no promises, just recognition. Eliza gently closed her eyes. For a moment. Then she opened them. She didn't cry, but her breathing slowed, becoming deeper, as if someone had just lifted a burden she had carried for too long, even if only a little. There are times, Eliza continued, her voice softer, when I think I've gotten used to it. Used to not belonging. But when you get used to it, it also means you no longer expect anything. Thomas nodded, very slightly. He understood. He had seen it in men who had lived alone for too long and women who had given up hope of being called by name. Eliza looked at Thomas for the first time since the story began. She looked straight at him, not scrutinizing, not hesitant. I don't know how long I can stay here, she said. But I know. I don't want to disappear silently again. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He waited for the question to linger in the air long enough so that it wouldn't be perceived as a request. Then he said, staying or leaving should both be your choice. It's not that he doesn't care. It's that he cares enough not to let Eliza's hurt become a burden. Outside, the night wind blew through the Red Willow Creek Valley, carrying the rustling of grass. The night on the frontier didn't hide the past. It only gave people space to confront it safely. Eliza sat for a little while longer, then stood up. Thank you, she said. Not because Thomas had said anything nice, but because he hadn't said too much. Before going upstairs, Eliza paused on the stairs. Perhaps I'll tell you more tomorrow, she said. Not a promise, just a possibility. Thomas nodded. Tomorrow, he repeated, as if confirming that time was still there. That night, Eliza slept very soundly. No dreams. Just a continuous, uninterrupted sleep, something she hadn't experienced in years. And in that sleep, Eliza's past no longer stood at the door like a debt collector. It sat down silently, as if for the first time being listened to without being hastily shut off. And from the following morning, when Eliza stepped outside with Thomas leaving the wooden walls to enter the wide-open valley, the silence of nature continued the conversation of the previous night, not through memories but through the gentle breath of a soul beginning to rest. That morning arrived very early in Red Willow Creek. There were no bells, no calls, just a thin beam of light filtering through the valley, touching the wooden roof still damp with dew, then slowly sliding down the dirt road leading out of town. Eliza Monroe woke up before Mrs. Hawthorne lit her stove. She sat in bed for a while, thinking nothing, a rare state, almost a luxury for someone accustomed to living with memories. As Eliza descended the stairs, Thomas Caldwell was waiting on the porch. He didn't knock. He didn't call her name. He just stood there, leaning lightly against the low wooden fence, as if he knew that if Eliza wanted to leave, she would come out on her own. Let's go down to the valley for a bit, Thomas said when he saw her. Not an invitation. Not a plan. Just a statement raising the possibility. Eliza nodded. They left the town, following a trail northward, where Red Willow Creek opened into a wide valley surrounded by old pine trees. There were no houses there, no fences, just land, water, and wind, things that had been there long before humans arrived and would remain long after humans left. They walked slowly. They didn't talk. The wind rustled through the tall grass, creating a steady sound like breathing. Eliza realized she was listening not with her ears but with her whole body. Each step she took felt secure, as if the earth were responding, I am here. I support you. The small stream meandered through the valley, its water so clear you could see the pebbles at the bottom. Thomas stopped at a bend where a fallen tree trunk formed a natural seat. He sat down. Eliza sat just far enough away from him so they didn't have to lean over to talk, but close enough so she wouldn't feel out of place. They sat there for a long time. Nobody said anything. Eliza looked up at the pine trees. The tall, straight trunks reached towards the blue sky without ostentation. She thought of her mother, a quiet woman who had worked her whole life without seeking recognition. For the first time, that memory didn't weigh heavily on her. It simply came and stayed like a part of the landscape. Thomas picked up a small stone and tossed it gently into the stream. The stone hit the water, creating ripples that spread out, then vanished. No one spoke of it, but Eliza saw and understood that every action can be gentle. After a moment, Eliza spoke. Her voice was low, as if she didn't want to break the silence. "It's quiet here, in a good way." Thomas didn't answer immediately. He smiled, very faintly. A smile not directed at Eliza, but at the valley, as if he had been waiting for that statement for a long time, not to confirm what he knew, but to hear Eliza realize it herself. "Here," he said, after a pause, "people don't need to explain who they are." Eliza nodded. She understood. Here, silence wasn't a void to be filled. It was a space for people to set aside things they'd carried for too long. They continued walking, following the stream. Eliza bent down and touched the water. Cold, clear, real. She washed her hands, letting the water wash away the thin layer of dust, a small gesture, but one that felt like completing a private ritual. Thomas told very little. Just a few disjointed sentences about winter, about how snow could block the path, about how the valley protected the town from strong winds. He didn't tell the story of his life. He told how the land cared for people, as if that were more important. Eliza listened, but her mind didn't cling to each word. She let the rhythm of nature guide her. Each step took her further away from the cramped rooms of memory and closer to a new feeling, being in the present without defense. They stopped under an old pine tree. Thomas spread his coat on the ground, setting it down naturally without asking Eliza if she wanted to sit. She sat. That gesture, small, wordless, made Eliza realize that kind care often doesn't need to be named. The wind blew harder. The scent of pine resin filled the air. Eliza closed her eyes. She didn't think about the past. She didn't think about the future. She just stayed there. In that moment, Eliza understood something she had been unable to name for years. People don't need to be fixed to deserve love. Sometimes they just need to be placed in a safe place to heal themselves. Thomas rose first, taking a small walk around the area as if to give Eliza some space. He didn't look at her. He left her alone, with the valley, the stream, and the wind. And in that solitude, Eliza didn't feel lonely. When they returned, the sun was high in the sky. The valley was no longer shrouded in mist. Everything was clear, unobstructed. Eliza walked more steadily, not faster, but more confidently. Before leaving the valley, Eliza paused, turning back for one last look. She didn't know how many times she would return here. But she knew this place had done something very important. It reminded her that silence could be her friend, not her enemy. Thomas stood waiting. He didn't ask Eliza how she felt. It wasn't necessary. They walked toward Red Willow Creek in the midday sun. The town loomed in the distance, small, unassuming, offering no promise of great things. But Eliza no longer saw it as a temporary stop. She saw it as a destination she was allowed to choose. And in her final steps before rediscovering the familiar dirt road, Eliza realized one thing very clearly. There are healings that don't come from words, but from being around someone who knows when to be silent in a place that doesn't demand you to be someone else. And it was from that quiet peace, when Eliza had begun to stand firm within herself, that Thomas understood it was time to say something important. Not to bind her, but to ensure that any feelings, if they existed, would always begin with choice, not obligation. That afternoon in Red Willow Creek was so quiet you could hear the dry grass rustling against the wooden fence. The valley in the distance still retained the coolness of the morning, but in the town the sun was high in the sky, shining down on the low roofs, revealing patches of peeling paint and old nail marks. Eliza Monroe sat by the window of her boarding house, mending a worn pillow. She wasn't in a hurry. Her needle moved up and down steadily, like her breathing gradually finding its rhythm again. Thomas Caldwell stood on the porch, looking out into the yard. He had arrived early but hadn't knocked yet. He waited until Eliza looked up, their eyes meeting through the frosted glass. Only then did Thomas knock softly once, then stop. Eliza opened the door. "Come in," she said. They sat opposite each other in the small living room. Mrs. Hawthorne had gone out early. The space was quiet enough for every word to carry its own weight. Thomas placed his hat on the table, clasped his hands together, then unfastened them. Eliza noticed this subtle difference, a rare sign that the man before her was about to say something that could not be said casually. Thomas was straightforward. "Eliza," he began, his voice low and slow as he always did when he needed to make sure the person opposite him heard and understood. "I've been thinking a lot." Eliza stopped. The needle rested still between her fingers. She looked at Thomas, waiting. "I don't want a woman to feel like she's being bought with letters." The words weren't loud. They weren't harsh. But they fell into the room like a heavy stone, not because of their volume, but because of their meaning. Eliza froze. During her weeks at Red Willow Creek, she had grown accustomed to Thomas's quiet kindness, accustomed to being given choices. But she never imagined that he, the man who had written the letters, who had waited for the train, would be the first to refuse the role society was ready to impose on her. Thomas continued without looking away. "I know we met because of those letters. But I don't want our relationship to begin with a sense of obligation, or with you thinking you have to stay because you came here." Eliza felt her heart slow down. Not faster, but deeper. She had prepared for many possibilities when she arrived at this frontier, being judged, being pitied, even being controlled. But she was never prepared for being given back full control. Thomas took a shallow breath. If you allow me," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I would like to pursue you as a respectable man. Not because I need a wife, and not because you need a support system. Simply because I respect you." Eliza didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands, hands accustomed to work, to endure, to remain silent. For years, Eliza had learned to humble herself, to speak less, and to expect less. So this moment when a man told her she wasn't needed but chosen left her unsure where to direct her emotions. "Do you know what that means?" Eliza asked, her voice even, but with a slight tremor at the end. "It means I can say no." Thomas nodded. "Yes." Eliza looked up. "And what if I say no?" Thomas looked directly at her. "Then I will respect that. No conditions attached, no disappointment revealed. Just a truth stated calmly." Eliza leaned back in her chair. She felt tired, not from the pain, but because a new door had just opened. The door to equality, where every choice was equally valuable. "All my life," Eliza said slowly, "people have always needed me for what I can do, care, serve, stay. This is the first time. Someone has said that I don't need to be indebted to be around." Thomas didn't reply. He let the statement remain in its entirety. Outside, the wind blew through the valley. The rustling of the pine trees echoed in like a slow, deliberate backdrop for this unhurried conversation. "I don't know where my feelings are going," Eliza continued. "I also don't know if I'll have the courage to start over." Thomas nodded. "I don't know either." Eliza smiled faintly. A very small smile, but genuine. "But perhaps," she said, "the important thing is, we all have the right not to know." Thomas smiled in return. Not the smile of a victor, but the smile of someone who had just laid the right foundation. They sat for a while longer. No one spoke further about correspondence, marriage, or the future. The conversation had accomplished its most important task, rectifying the imbalance. As Thomas stood up to leave, he put on his hat but still paused at the door. "Eliza," he said, "I won't ask for the answer today." Eliza nodded. "Thank you." It wasn't because he gave her a chance. It was because he gave her time. Thomas left the inn, walking slowly down the dirt road. Eliza stood at the door, watching him go. This time, as his figure disappeared from view, she didn't feel a sense of loss. She felt secure. For the first time in her life, Eliza Monroe understood that love, if it comes, won't come from necessity. It will come from a choice of both people. And it was when she was no longer bound by any obligations that Eliza began to wonder if moving forward was no longer a chore. Would she have the courage to try believing, even if only for a short distance ahead? That night, Red Willow Creek fell silent earlier than usual. Not because of the weather, but because of the people. After a long day, the oil lamps in the town were lit, and then extinguished one by one, as if everyone knew it was time to close their minds. The night wind blew through the valley, not strong, just enough to gently sway the pine branches and carry the familiar scent of damp earth. Eliza Monroe lay on the bed in her small motel room. She wasn't sleeping. The oil lamp on the table still burned, casting a pale yellow light on the old wooden wall where faint scratches of time were visible. Eliza gazed at these scratches for a long time, as if they were a map of the years gone by, not straight, not clearly oriented, but still guiding her forward. Thomas Caldwell said things that were not easy to say, not because the words were complicated, but because they broke the mold Eliza had carried throughout her life. A man who refused the right to possess a woman. A man who said she could leave without feeling indebted. Eliza turned and looked up at the ceiling. In the dim light, memories surfaced quietly without struggle. Just familiar images: the old kitchen in Pennsylvania, her mother's hospital bed, the meals she had eaten sitting at the corner table. No one chased her away, but no one tried to keep her either. All her life, Eliza had been accustomed to being accepted on conditions. Stay if she helped. Be left alone if she didn't demand it. Be present if she knew her place. And then in Red Willow Creek there was a man who said she didn't need to stand any lower to be near him. Eliza closed her eyes. She wasn't searching for an answer. She simply let the question remain. If she moved forward this time, would it be because she wanted to, and not because she feared being left behind? Outside the window the wind blew steadily. There was no train noise, no bells, just the night quiet enough to hear oneself. Eliza thought about leaving. Not because she wanted to escape, but because that was something she always knew how to do. Get on a ship. Go somewhere else. Start over without leaving a trace. But the thought didn't bring the same relief as before. It only made her feel tired. Then Eliza thought about staying. Not because of Thomas. Not because of the town. But because for the first time staying didn't mean being held captive. She sat up and extinguished the oil lamp. The room was plunged into darkness, but it wasn't frightening. Eliza lay down, placed her hand on her chest, and felt her slow heartbeat. She slept not deeply, but long enough for the morning to come without burden. The next morning, Red Willow Creek awoke to gentle sunlight. Eliza went down to the kitchen earlier than usual to help Mrs. Hawthorne prepare breakfast. No one said much. Not necessary. Some decisions don't need to be announced. Thomas arrived just as the sun rose over the hills. He stood on the porch, not coming inside. Eliza saw him through the window, and in that moment she realized she was no longer caught between choice and fear. She was simply standing before an unknown path. They walked toward the small stream where the valley opened up. No one brought up yesterday's conversation. Thomas didn't ask Eliza what she had decided. He knew that if there was an answer, it would come when she was ready. They sat on the familiar rock. A gentle breeze blew. The water flowed steadily. Eliza looked down at the stream where the sunlight reflected off shimmering silver fragments. She thought about her life, not to judge, but to acknowledge how far she had come to get here. Eliza took a deep breath. Then she spoke. I don't know how this ends. She paused, not out of emotion, but to make sure that what she was about to say was true. But I'm willing to walk a little farther. Thomas didn't react immediately. He didn't smile. He didn't sigh in relief. He didn't move closer. He simply nodded, a very slight nod, as if receiving something sacred. Eliza turned to look at him. That doesn't mean I'm making a promise, she added, as if to clarify. I'm just allowing myself to hope. Thomas replied in a low, firm voice. That's enough. Neither of them said anything more. They sat there silently, letting the decision find its place in the vast open space. Eliza felt relieved. Not because everything was clear now, but because she no longer had to defend herself against her own hope. From that day on, their relationship didn't change much, at least not outwardly. They still walked, still spoke briefly, still kept their distance. But one thing was distinctly different. Eliza was no longer aloof from her own life. She began to become more involved in town life. Not to prove anything, just because she wanted to. Thomas didn't lead. He walked alongside her as he always did. That afternoon they worked together to repair the fence near the stream. Thomas did the heavy lifting. Eliza provided the nails. No one called it working together, but they both knew it was. Eliza realized that testing trust wasn't one big act. It was a series of small choices repeated each day, staying an extra afternoon, saying one more honest word, walking a short distance further. And it was in these little things that hope, something Eliza had carefully kept hidden for so long, began to stand tall, unwavering, unhurried. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time she no longer needed to know. And when Eliza chose to take another step forward, Red Willow Creek with its simple and kind people began to respond, not with words, but with small actions that were enough to turn a stranger into someone welcomed. Caldwell Ranch is not far from Red Willow Creek, but far enough to feel like you've left the town. The dirt road leading to the ranch winds gently through a low willow grove, then opens up into a wide expanse of meadows stretching to the foothills. The morning Eliza Monroe arrived, the sun wasn't harsh. Thin clouds obscured the light, making everything seem softer, as if the land itself understood that it was a day for gentleness. Thomas Caldwell went ahead, leading the way. Eliza followed behind, unhurried. The farm wasn't large. There were no high fences or iron gates. Just a few rows of wooden sheds, a low main house with a faded roof, and people working. They didn't look up immediately when someone approached, but they didn't seem distant either. Thomas didn't introduce Eliza verbally. He simply paused, allowing her presence to be felt. The first to approach was Samuel Pike, the farm's longtime manager. He was over 60, his back slightly hunched, his hands calloused from hard work. He looked at Eliza for a moment, not scrutinizing her, but simply as if taking note of a new face. Then he nodded and turned to Thomas. "She's traveling a long distance." Not a question, not a judgment, just an observation. Thomas replied, "Yes." Samuel turned to look at Eliza. "It's still hot in the kitchen. Go eat first. Don't ask who she is. Don't ask how long she'll be staying. Just open a very specific door." Eliza followed Thomas into the back kitchen of the main house. The smell of soup wafted up, warm and familiar. On the table were thick slices of bread and a pot of simmering bean soup. Mrs. Margaret Pike, Samuel's wife, placed another bowl on the table without saying a word. She simply pushed it toward Eliza. Eliza sat down. She picked up the spoon. A short sip. No one waited for her to say thank you. No one stared. They ate in quiet silence, occasionally exchanging a few words about their afternoon work, about the cattle to the west, about the wind last night that had knocked down an old wooden post. Eliza listened, then realized she didn't need to interrupt to be present. After the meal, Margaret placed a neatly folded woolen blanket on the chair next to Eliza. "It's cold here at night," she said. "The east room if you wish to rest." Eliza touched the blanket. Coarse wool. Warm, really warm. "Thank you," she said in a low voice. Margaret simply nodded, as if the thank you didn't need to be reciprocated. In the afternoon, Eliza took a walk around the farm. Thomas didn't accompany her closely. He let her see and feel for herself. She saw the hired workers, a young family with 2 small children, a widower living in the log cabin at the back, a young girl helping in the kitchen. No one seemed overly curious. No one asked personal questions. As Eliza stood watching the cows, Noah Pike, Samuel's grandson, ran up to her and offered her an apple. "Eat this," he said, and then ran off. "It doesn't matter who she is. It doesn't matter where she comes from." Eliza took a bite of the apple. Sweet, crisp. She stood there gazing at the valley stretching out into the distance, and for the first time in many years she no longer felt like she was taking someone else's place. Evening fell. The wind picked up. People gradually began to pack up. Thomas led Eliza to the east room. The room was simple, a wooden bed, a small table, a window overlooking the meadow. Eliza set down her old bag and hung her coat on the hook. There was no sense of temporarity, just a room waiting to be used. Dinner was served early. Everyone sat around a long table. No one introduced Eliza by title. No fiancé. No newcomer. She was simply the person sitting there, and that was enough. During the meal, Samuel Pike said a short sentence in a low voice. "You can rest assured while you're here. People here work together, that's all." Then he looked at Eliza and added, "You're safe here." No emphasis. No promises. Just a fact stated like the weather or the harvest. Eliza bowed her head. Not out of overwhelming emotion, but because those words had struck a chord with her. That night, Eliza lay under her woolen blanket listening to the wind in the meadow. It wasn't the wind that reminded her of the time she had to leave. Rather, it was the wind of a place that wouldn't push her away. In the days that followed, Eliza began to integrate into the rhythm of life at Caldwell Ranch. No one assigned her tasks. She did whatever she felt was necessary, helping in the kitchen, mending coats, tending to the small vegetable patch in the backyard. Her help was taken for granted, without praise, without scrutiny. Eliza realized something very important here. A person's value lies not in how they arrived, but in how they stay. Thomas maintained his distance. He didn't place Eliza in his own place. He let the community embrace her in their own way. And because of this, Eliza didn't feel like she was entering Thomas's life. She felt like she was entering a larger embrace. One evening, when work was finished early, everyone sat on the porch. No one spoke of big stories. Just fragmented pieces of life. One winter, a storm destroyed the old barn. A calf was rescued from the stream. Eliza listened, then contributed a very small remark. No one fell silent in surprise. No one changed the subject. She was in the conversation without asking permission. Eliza understood that a community isn't a place where people ask, "Who are you?" but rather a place where they say, "Just stay here." And it was in that stay that Eliza Monroe began to see herself take on a more distinct form, not because she was validated by anyone, but because she was allowed to exist without suspicion. And once Eliza was allowed to stay as part of Caldwell Ranch without having to prove anything or feel indebted, her relationship with Thomas gradually entered a new phase where marriage was no longer a solution but a practical choice built on days of working together and enduring together. Thomas Caldwell and Eliza Monroe's wedding took place on a light gray morning, with mist still clinging to the meadows east of Caldwell Ranch. There were no flower wreaths, no music, just a small gathering on the porch of the log cabin where those who had become accustomed to working together stood side by side in the labor, witnessing the event. The pastor from Red Willow Creek arrived early. He read short, clear words without embellishment. No talk of passion. No talk of destiny. Only talk of responsibility, loyalty, and choosing to stay when things aren't easy. Eliza stood upright. She wore a dark brown dress altered to fit. Not new, but clean. Thomas stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the brim of his hat. When they exchanged their vows, neither trembled. They looked at each other with the eyes of people who knew exactly what they were about to do. There was no lingering kiss, just a nod, a quiet affirmation. Then everyone dispersed. No party, no boisterous toasts. Margaret Pike placed a freshly baked loaf of bread on the table. Samuel nodded to Thomas. That was enough. Their marriage began like this, without drama, without dreams. The following days passed in the familiar rhythm of life at Caldwell Ranch. Eliza moved her belongings into the east room where she had lived before. There was no wedding night in the usual sense. It was simply a rearrangement of their living space. A desk was placed near the window for easy note-taking. Additional wooden shelves were added to hold books and notebooks, and coat hooks were lowered so Eliza could reach them more easily. Thomas and Eliza worked together. In the morning they checked on the herd. Thomas handled the heavy lifting, repairing the fence, inspecting the barn. Eliza took notes, the number of cows, feed costs, and sick ones. She was careful, accurate, and never complained. Thomas didn't double-check. He trusted her. At lunchtime, Eliza sat at her wooden desk, opening her ledgers. Numbers were nothing new to her. All her life, Eliza had been accustomed to calculating to make ends meet. She didn't say much, but Thomas recognized the small savings and sensible adjustments. The farm wasn't getting rich quickly, but it was becoming more stable. In the afternoon, they herded the cattle further out. On some days, the sun was scorching and the wind carried fine dust that clung to their clothes. Eliza covered her face and continued walking. Thomas slowed down so she wouldn't have to walk too fast. No one mentioned it. But they both knew. Winter arrived early that year. Snow blanketed the meadows. The wind was strong. The road to town had been blocked for days. The nights were longer. The cold seeped into every crack in the wood. Eliza woke up before dawn, lit the fire, and made soup. Thomas shoveled snow and reinforced the barn door. They ate in silence, then continued on their way. Some nights the wind howled so fiercely that Eliza would wake up with a start. Thomas would get up first, put on his coat, and go check on things. Eliza didn't call after him. She knew he would come back. And he always came back wet, cold, but more reassuring. They didn't argue much. Not because they were alike, but because they both knew when to remain silent. There were minor disagreements about whether to buy more livestock, about whether to repair the roof or wait until spring. They discussed it. Sometimes they didn't agree right away, but no one walked away. No one used silence as punishment. Eliza realized one thing very clearly. Their love wasn't about fleeting emotions, but about having someone by their side every day. The harshest winter was when a snowstorm lasted 3 days. The barn partially collapsed. 2 calves died of the cold. Eliza took notes, her hands trembling with the chill. Thomas stood silently for a long time in front of the barn. He said nothing. Eliza offered no comfort. She placed her hand on his shoulder and stood there. That was all. After the storm, they repaired the shed. Slowly. Hard work. No one talked about the loss. But they both understood that this was an unavoidable part of the life they had chosen. When spring arrived, the meadow came alive again. Eliza planted another small vegetable patch. Thomas rebuilt the fence on the west side. They worked, then sat down to rest, watching the sun set behind the hills. There were no grand promises, just short-term plans next week, next season. Eliza wasn't disappointed that her marriage wasn't all rosy. She felt relieved. Because she didn't have to play the role of a happy wife. She just needed to be herself, an older woman working, thinking, and being respected in every little decision. Thomas felt the same way. He didn't have to play the perfect husband. He just needed to be there regularly on good days and bad days. One evening after the paperwork was finished, Eliza said very softly, "I feel fine." Thomas nodded. "Me too." No further additions are needed. Their marriage wasn't told through memorable moments but through days that passed without leaving a scar. And for those who have lived long enough to know the value of that, it's a rare kind of happiness. Eliza understood that not every marriage needs to be spectacular. Some marriages just need to be stable enough that people don't have to start over. And it was in that enduring tranquility as Thomas and Eliza became accustomed to sharing the burden that a new bond, deeper and more fragile than any other, began to emerge, forcing them to confront the fear of loss in a completely different way. Eliza learned she was pregnant one very ordinary morning. There were no obvious signs, no particular premonition. Just an unusual, more persistent feeling of fatigue than usual. She sat on the east porch of Caldwell Ranch watching the morning sun fall on the meadow and understood her life was about to enter a phase of no return. She didn't tell Thomas right away. It wasn't because of fear. It was because Eliza needed time to listen to herself. At her age, pregnancy wasn't something to be desired. It wasn't often said aloud, but everyone knew. Eliza had lived her whole life in a state of readiness to accept things not meant for her. So when it came, she wasn't overjoyed. She simply sat there, her hand on her belly, and whispered softly, "If you come, I will stay." That evening when the books were closed and only embers remained in the hearth, Eliza spoke to Thomas. "I'm pregnant." Thomas didn't answer immediately. He stood silently by the window, gazing out into the darkness. The night wind blew across the meadow, carrying the scent of damp earth and dry grass. In that moment, Eliza saw something she rarely saw in him, an unhidden vulnerability. Thomas turned around. He placed his hands on the table, his voice low and slow. "Are you sure?" Eliza nodded. Thomas sat down. He said nothing more for a very long time. Eliza didn't mistake that silence for indifference. She had learned to distinguish between the silence of someone who didn't care and the silence of someone trying to maintain their composure. Thomas belonged to the latter category. "I'm scared," he finally said. "No beating around the bush. No false assertiveness. I'm afraid I won't be able to hold on," Thomas continued, his eyes still fixed on the wooden floor. "I've lost too much already." Eliza understood. Thomas had never told her the details of his past, but Eliza knew enough to understand that loss was nothing new to him. In this frontier region, people learned to work hard, but no one was taught how to confront the fear of loving again. Eliza stepped forward and placed her hand on his shoulder. No words of comfort, just her presence. "I'm scared too," she said. "But maybe, this time, we won't be going alone." Thomas looked up. His eyes were red, but no tears fell. From that day on, everything changed quietly but undeniably. Eliza continued working, but more slowly. Thomas noticed more. He didn't ask, but he did. He adjusted the doorstep to be lower, brought the water closer, did small things he didn't name. Eliza didn't object. She understood that this was Thomas's way of showing the concern he could endure. The months of pregnancy pass between the seasons. Autumn is a pale yellow. Winter is long and harsh. Some nights Eliza couldn't sleep because of her back pain. Thomas stayed awake with her sitting by the bed, his hand on the blanket. He didn't know what else to do, but he was there, and that was enough. When spring arrived, Eliza had become heavier. The meadows turned green again. Thomas looked at the young grass and thought of the child about to be born, a being who had never known the losses its parents had suffered. The thought filled him with both hope and fear. Eliza went into labor on a cloudy afternoon. Madame Margaret Pike was called. Thomas stood outside, unable to do anything but pack back and forth on the porch. The wind blew fiercely. The meadow rustled. Thomas felt small in the face of all that might come for the first time since he had decided to stay in this land. Eliza's voice came from inside the room. Not loud, but enough for Thomas to understand that this was not something he could control. He sat down on the doorstep, bowed his head. For the first time in many years, Thomas Caldwell prayed not for anything grand, just to be allowed to stay and be a father. When the baby's cry rang out, it wasn't loud. It was thin, trembling, but real. Thomas jumped to his feet. Margaret opened the door and nodded at him. "My son," she said. Thomas entered the room. Eliza lay on the bed, tired but alert. The baby was in her arms. Thomas stood beside her, hesitant to touch it immediately. He gazed at the child for a long time, as if trying to memorize every detail, every breath. "I'm scared," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I'm scared of losing." Eliza looked up at him. "I know," she said. "But if we don't allow ourselves to love, then the loss loses all meaning." Thomas bent down and placed his hand on the child's back. Small, warm, alive. In that moment, Thomas understood that love was no longer a choice. It had become a bondage he could not escape and did not want to escape. The days that followed were a series of sleepless, exhausting but vibrant days. Eliza learned to be a mother. Thomas learned to be a father. Neither of them did it well from the start, but they stayed together through each long night. Eliza watched Thomas cradle the baby, clumsy but careful. Thomas watched Eliza rock the baby to sleep, his eyes softer than anything he had ever known about himself. Caldwell Ranch hasn't changed much. The work is still there. The wind still blows. But in the eastern cabin, there's a new rhythm to it, and that changes everything. Eliza understood that true love isn't about finding a safe place for yourself, but about being willing to become a safe place for another living being. And Thomas understood that. Even though the fear of loss will never disappear, loving someone is always worth the sacrifice. And as Caldwell Ranch gained another life to protect Thomas, and Eliza realized that the challenges ahead would no longer be just theirs, a battle to preserve the land, the water, and the future of their entire family. That summer arrived early and was drier than usual. The ground around Red Willow Creek cracked into thin lines like wrinkles on the face of someone who had lived too long with the wind and sun. The stream flowing through Caldwell Ranch still had water, but it was lower than usual. More pebbles were exposed, and the sound of water hitting the rocks was no longer as full as before. To outsiders, it was just a sign of the dry season. For those who depended on the land, it was the first warning sign. Thomas Caldwell realized it before anyone else told him. He walked along the stream every morning, bending down to measure the water level with his eyes, a habit formed over the years. He didn't tell Eliza right away. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because he hadn't yet found a way to express it while he himself was still trying to understand what was happening. Rumors spread to Red Willow Creek in the way rumors often do, slowly, vaguely, then suddenly becoming clear. A wealthy landowner from the south, Henry Whitaker, had bought up much of the upstream land. It was said he planned to channel water toward his large ranch to feed a herd of cattle far exceeding any the valley had ever known. Thomas overheard the story in the grocery store. The store owner spoke very softly, as if afraid his words might dry up the stream further. "Whitaker has the paperwork," he said. "He hired a lawyer from Cheyenne. He says it's legal." Thomas didn't answer. He placed his order on the counter, paid, and went outside. A hot wind blew across the dirt road. In that moment, Thomas felt something very strange, a sense of powerlessness, a feeling he wasn't used to carrying. At Caldwell Ranch, Thomas checked every ditch, every section of the water conduit. Everything was still there. But he knew that if the upstream water source was blocked, all of it would be meaningless. The ranch couldn't survive on sheer willpower. The family couldn't survive on mere resilience. Eliza watched Thomas change day by day. He spoke less. He moved around more. In the evenings, he would sit for long periods in front of his books, without turning a page. Eliza didn't ask. not because she didn't care, but because she understood that some men's anxieties only become apparent after they've tried everything in silence. One evening, while Eliza was rocking her baby to sleep, Thomas stood on the porch for a long time. His shadow stretched long across the wooden floor. When Eliza came out, Thomas didn't turn back immediately. "If the water is blocked," he said, his voice low and dry, "we won't survive a season." Eliza wasn't startled. She had been waiting for that statement. "Have you spoken to Whitaker yet?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "He doesn't speak. He only speaks through his lawyer." It was the first time Eliza saw Thomas admit he had no clear path forward. The man who had once stood firm in the face of loss, in the face of harsh winter, now stood before something even more intangible: rules, paperwork, and money. In the days that followed, Thomas went to see this person and that person, other farmers, small ranchers. Everyone was worried, but no one knew what to do. Whitaker was too big, too rich, and most importantly, he didn't need this valley to exist. Eliza listened to everything. She sat quietly during those conversations, holding her child, mending clothes, pouring water. No one asked for her opinion. No one expected it. And because of that, she could see things more clearly. Eliza recalled her past years of being overlooked, of being disregarded in decisions. She learned to observe from the sidelines. She learned to listen to what was left unsaid. And now that skill has become incredibly sharp. One evening, when Thomas returned home after a long, fruitless day, he sat down in his chair, head bowed. Eliza placed a bowl of soup in front of him. "I'm not afraid of losing the land," Eliza said, her voice very soft. "I'm afraid of not being able to protect my family." Thomas looked up. His eyes were tired, but he didn't deny it. "You chose to stay in this land," Eliza continued. "You chose responsibility. But Whitaker, he doesn't live that way." Thomas clenched his fists. "I don't know how to fight back." Eliza didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window where a faint moon hung over the valley. The stream glistened in the darkness, fragile yet flowing. "There are battles," Eliza said slowly, "that cannot be won by brute force." Thomas remained silent. That night, Eliza didn't go to sleep right away. She took out old papers from a chest, books, receipts, some documents Thomas had kept since the land purchase. She read each page by the oil lamp. Not in a hurry. Not missing a beat. Thomas woke up in the middle of the night and saw Eliza still sitting there. "What are you doing?" he asked. Eliza looked up. "I want to understand who this land belongs to. And why." Thomas gazed at her for a long time. In that moment he realized something that surprised and embarrassed him. He had become so accustomed to shouldering burdens alone that he had forgotten Eliza was also on his side. Over the following days, Eliza continued to observe, read, and ask, not loudly, but to the right people at the right time. Mrs. Hawthorne, Mr. Samuel Pike, people who had lived at Red Willow Creek before Whitaker arrived. Old stories were gradually recounted: how the stream had been shared, how boundaries had been established, and the oral agreements that had existed. Thomas watched Eliza work in silence, and for the first time he felt that his role was no longer that of the sole person bearing the brunt of the responsibility. The feeling was both a relief and a dread, because if Eliza is right, then this battle won't take place on the meadow. It will take place where Thomas has never stood firm: reason, law, and the community's memory. And in that quiet preparation, as the most steadfast man of Caldwell Ranch first faltered, Eliza Monroe began to stand tall in her own way, not by strength but by understanding and patience honed through a lifetime of being looked down upon. And while Thomas was still struggling to stand firm against the pressures of power and money, Eliza, once considered the underdog, quietly prepared to step into the spotlight, not to confront with emotion, but to speak the truth that the entire valley had lived with for generations. Eliza Monroe began reading law late into the night. Not because she enjoyed books, but because there was no other way. When Caldwell Ranch faced the threat of losing its water source, Eliza understood that this wasn't a battle to be won by labor or the familiar resilience of the frontier. This was a battle of paperwork, of history, and of things that had been written but forgotten. She read by the oil lamp while Thomas was asleep. Old notebooks borrowed from the Church County archives, water usage regulations written in a dry, unapproachable language. Eliza read slowly, underlined, made notes in the margins. Didn't miss anything. All her life she had been accustomed to educating herself to survive, and now that habit had become her strength. Thomas knew what Eliza was doing, but he didn't stop her. He didn't help. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood that this was something Eliza needed to do herself. The man who used to take the lead was now learning to step back, not because he was weak, but because he trusted her. On the day the Red Willow County Court opened its hearing, the weather was clear and cool. Eliza wore the simplest brown dress. No jewelry, no symbols. She didn't want to draw attention to herself. She just wanted to be heard. Thomas stood outside the courthouse. He didn't go in. "I'm here," he said to Eliza, before she went inside. Not to protect her, just to be there if needed. Eliza nodded, then ascended the old stone steps of the courthouse. Each step echoed clearly in the quiet morning air. A few townspeople were present, not many, but enough to keep the room from feeling empty. Henry Whitaker sat in the front row, his coat neatly pressed, his lawyer beside him, his books neatly arranged. Eliza sat alone. No one represents them. No one speaks on their behalf. When it was her turn, Eliza stood up. She didn't look at Whitaker first. She looked straight at the judge, a man who had lived in this district long enough to know that the law was not just written words, but also the memory of the community. Eliza began to speak. Her voice didn't tremble. It wasn't loud, but it was firm. She spoke of Red Willow Creek, not just a stream, but the backbone of the valley. She presented old documents, water use agreements from before Whitaker bought the land. She mentioned how small farms shared water during droughts, how the community survived not through wealth but through fairness passed down through generations. Whitaker's lawyers countered. They talked about ownership, about investment, about development. Eliza listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react. Then it was her turn to speak. "Your Honor," Eliza said, her hand resting lightly on the table, "if the country belonged only to the richest man, this land would have been dead long ago." The room was silent. Eliza looked around. She saw familiar faces, people who had lived by this stream, who had raised livestock, cultivated crops, nurtured their children, and buried their loved ones here. Then she said something that many people still repeat today: this land survives on truth, not money. This land survives because of truth, not money. Not rhetoric, not a call to action, just a truth spoken at the right time. Eliza said nothing more about herself. She didn't talk about her personal struggles. She spoke about a universal moral principle that the law is created to protect life, not to legitimize its deprivation. The judge ordered a review of the documents. He questioned more witnesses. The elders of the community stood up, not to elaborate, just to confirm. The fragmented memories pieced together into a picture that Whitaker could not buy. The trial lasted until the afternoon. When the verdict was delivered, it was quiet. No applause. Just a clear statement: the water source is protected under the traditional community rights of Red Willow Creek. Eliza sat down. No sigh of relief. No tears. She closed her eyes for just a moment, enough to feel that she had regained her balance. Outside, Thomas waited. When Eliza came out, he looked at her for a long time. Not with the gaze of a worried husband, but with the gaze of a man who had just witnessed the greatest silent strength of his life. "You can do it," he said. Eliza nodded. "We can do it." It wasn't because they won a lawsuit. It was because their dignity wasn't bought cheaply. That evening, Caldwell Ranch was brightly lit. No celebration. Just a more elaborate meal than usual. Samuel Pike raised his glass of water. "No wine," he said briefly. "We're still here." Eliza sat beside Thomas, her son asleep in her arms. She looked around. The faces that had once treated her like a stranger now gazed at her with quiet respect. Eliza understood that justice isn't always loud and boisterous. Sometimes all it takes is one person to stand up and speak the truth calmly. And it was in that very moment that Eliza Monroe, a woman who had once been looked down upon, who had once stood on the margins, became the moral pillar of an entire community. And as the waters of Red Willow Creek continued to flow as they had for generations, time quietly slipped away, bringing with it changes not through events but through the legacy that Eliza and Thomas left for those who came after them. Time didn't arrive at Caldwell Ranch with noisy footsteps. It came silently, like the morning dew that settles on the meadows each day. No one called, no one chased, but everyone knew it had been there for some time. The years after the water lawsuit passed steadily. No more major events. No more life or death decisions. Just a life going on day after day, season after season. Eliza and Thomas's son grew up in the meadows. He learned to walk before he learned to talk. He learned to recognize the weather before he learned to read. He knew which streams dried up at the end of summer, which hills caught the strongest winds in winter. Thomas taught his son to herd cattle not with lengthy lectures but by standing beside him, letting him see and understand for himself. Eliza raised her children differently. She taught through listening. By sitting down when they told stories, no matter how small. By asking questions instead of giving answers. The children grew up in a home without yelling but also without overindulgence. There were boundaries. There was responsibility. And there was trust. As their son entered his teens, Red Willow Creek changed a little. A few more houses were added. The train service became more regular. But Caldwell Ranch maintained its old rhythm, not chasing expansion, not selling land when prices rose. Thomas simply put, "We just keep what we can take care of." Eliza didn't object. She understood that legacy isn't about leaving more, but about leaving the right legacy. Over time, Eliza Monroe became a name spoken with respect. Not because she had won a lawsuit, but because people turned to her for unhurried advice, for minor boundary disputes, for difficult family matters. Eliza listened before speaking, and when she spoke, she didn't judge. She simply asked the right questions. On some afternoons, she would sit on the porch mending clothes or folding paper, and people from the town would stop by. No one called her Mrs. Caldwell with any distance. They called her Eliza, as if she were someone who had lived there for a very long time. Thomas aged in the manner of a man from the frontier. No complaining, no boasting. His back was more hunched, his steps were slower, but his eyes, the same eyes as the day Eliza stepped off the ship, were deep, direct, and kind. He no longer did the heavy work. He let his son do it. He stood beside him, observed, corrected mistakes when necessary, but didn't take over. There were evenings when Thomas and Eliza sat together in silence. Their son had spent his days away apprenticeship work in another town. Eliza wasn't as worried as she had imagined. She knew he had been equipped with the most important thing, the ability to stay true to himself. Time leaves its mark on everything. On the fence, on the roof, on the dark wooden walls, but it also left a lasting legacy. Caldwell Ranch wasn't rich, but it wasn't lacking. Not famous, but it was known. When there was a drought, they shared water. When there was a bountiful harvest, they shared food. No one remembers the lawsuit as a victory. They remember it as a moment when the community chose to stand together. Eliza understood that honor doesn't come from having your name recorded, but from being trusted. One autumn afternoon, their son returned home accompanied by a girlfriend. Thomas stood up and shook her hand. Eliza invited them inside, setting extra dishes on the table. No pressing questions. No scrutiny. Eliza looked at her son, at the way he sat, the way he listened, and understood that she had done enough. Night fell. The wind blew through the valley. Red Willow Creek flowed as it had flowed before Eliza arrived and would continue to flow after she left. Eliza sat beside Thomas on the porch steps. She rested her head on his shoulder. Thomas spoke. He placed his hand on hers. That gesture, after all these years, remained just as rhythmic. Eliza reflected on her life. Not to summarize it, just to realize that she had lived. Not perfect, not easy, but kind. She no longer needed to prove her worth. She saw it in her son's eyes, in the respect of the community, in the peace of those unhurried afternoons. Thomas turned to look at Eliza. "Are you all right?" he asked. Eliza smiled. "I'm enough." A short word. But it encapsulates a lifetime. In the twilight, Caldwell Ranch isn't dazzling, it's subdued. Enduring. Like the people who chose to stay, chose to work, chose to love, not to be seen, but to leave behind something that stands stronger than themselves. And if someone were to pass through this place, they wouldn't see a romantic story. They would see a house, a farm, a community. But if they stayed long enough, they would feel the true legacy, kindness passed on, not in words but in life. And when old age arrives, not like a robber but like an old friend. Knocking gently, Thomas and Eliza sit together on the porch where all beginnings took place, to say thank you for a decision made long ago. That afternoon arrived very slowly at Caldwell Ranch. Not because the sun was hesitant, but because time seemed to have learned not to rush with the two people who had walked alongside it for a lifetime. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the meadows, no longer harsh, no longer dazzling, just warm enough to bring out the muted golden hues that only old age can fully appreciate. Thomas Caldwell sat on a wooden chair on the porch. Eliza Monroe sat beside him. They remained silent for a very long time. A gentle breeze blew from the Red Willow Creek Valley, carrying the scent of dry grass and damp earth, the scent of seasons gone by. The stream in the distance still flowed slower than before, but steadily, like the breath of someone who had lived long enough to need no further proof. Thomas had aged noticeably in recent years. His hair was almost completely gray. His hands trembled slightly when the wind picked up. But his posture remained upright, and his eyes, those eyes, retained the same calmness as the day he stood on the platform waiting for a woman who might or might not disembark from the train. Eliza had also grown older. The wrinkles around her eyes deepened. Her hair, neatly tied back, was white, but her back remained straight. Her gait was still steady. There were a lingering pain within her, a pain she neither named nor complained of. She had learned to live with it as she lived with the weather. They sat there watching the sunset over Caldwell Ranch, once a strange destination, once a place of challenges, once a battlefield, and finally a home. "Do you remember the train station?" Thomas asked, his voice low and slow. Eliza smiled. "I remember. No need to say more." They both remember it very clearly. "I remember that autumn. I remember the screeching of the train. I remember Eliza clutching her old bag tightly in her hand. I remember that moment of standing between staying and leaving, a moment that, if missed, would never come again in a lifetime." Thomas gazed toward the dirt road leading out of town as if it still stretched straight to the train station of yesteryear. "I didn't know," he said, "whether you would get down." Eliza nodded slightly. "I don't know either." Thomas was silent for a moment. Then he said the words he had carried in his heart for years, but only now were they mature enough to be spoken aloud. "Thank you for stepping off that train." No emphasis, no trembling, just a thank you, complete and belated in the most beautiful way. Eliza did not respond verbally. She rested her head on Thomas's shoulder. The gesture came so naturally that it seemed to have always been there, just waiting for the right amount of time to surface. Thomas tilted his head slightly, touching her silver hair. They sat close together, not for warmth, but because it was the position they had chosen for a lifetime. Eliza reflected on the path she had taken. From a woman considered too late, too little value, belonging nowhere, to a mother, a wife, a respected figure in the community. Not because she became exceptional, but because she never gave up her dignity. Eliza has no regrets. No regrets about the difficult years. No regrets about the times I had to remain silent. No regrets that marriage wasn't all rosy. Because if any of those things were missing, she wouldn't be sitting here fulfilled in her own way. Thomas has no regrets either. He thought about the harsh winters, the sleepless nights filled with worry, the fears of loss that never truly disappeared. But he understood that, without that fear, his love wouldn't have been so deep. The sun touched the edge of the hill. The light turned a deep orange. The shadows of the two figures stretched long across the old wooden floor of the porch, two thin yet closely intertwined silhouettes, as if they had known each other for a long time before they actually met. "Do you consider yourself lucky?" Thomas asked, without turning to look at her. Eliza thought for a moment. Then she replied in a very soft voice, "I feel like I have lived the right life." Thomas smiled, a very small smile. "Enough. No further additions are needed. The Red Willow Creek still flows. Caldwell Ranch still stands. No storyteller needed. No certification required. If one day someone happens to pass by this place, they won't find a big story. They'll see an old farmhouse, a wooden porch, 2 chairs. But if they stay long enough, they'll sense what remains of a decent life. It's not about possessions, not about fame. It's about a feeling that's hard to put into words, the feeling that there are people who have loved each other not to escape loneliness but to face life together from the very first moment until there's nothing left to prove." Eliza let out a soft sigh. Thomas gently squeezed her hand. The sun was setting. Night was falling. And in that silence, the story concludes not with an exclamation point, but with a long, peaceful, and regretless sigh. There are stories that don't make us cry the moment we hear them, but they linger and return when we're older to remind us that the most precious thing isn't what we achieve, but what we chose and what we stayed with until the end. As the story of Eliza Monroe and Thomas Caldwell concludes, what remains is not a perfect ending, but a feeling very familiar to those who have lived long enough. I have experienced much loss, but I still choose to live a decent life. This story reminds us that love isn't a miraculous salvation, but rather the enduring presence of two people who respect each other. Thomas didn't save Eliza. He simply gave her the power of choice, something many people in their lives never get. It's never too late to take another step as long as that step is taken willingly. Eliza didn't promise anything grand. She simply said, "I'm willing to go a little further." And it was those little further steps that shaped her entire life. A person's worth lies not in how they are initially perceived, but in how they stand firm when life challenges them. From a woman who was once looked down upon, Eliza became a pillar of moral support for her community, not through a loud voice but through unwavering conviction and righteousness. For those who have lived half their lives, this story doesn't ask us to change our lives. It simply asks us to, are you living up to what you believe is right? If so, that's enough. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you see yourself somewhere in Eliza and Thomas's journey, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps slow human stories like this continue to be told for hearts that still believe living a decent life is never a wrong choice.